They do believe that because they are deal makers in their private life, that they can transpose that muscle to international, war and peace, conflict resolution, and diplomacy. But it clearly has not worked.
Foreign ministers are meeting in Brussels this morning to digest Russia's latest rejection of a peace deal in Ukraine. The Kremlin said it was no closer to a breakthrough after talks in Moscow, attended by Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff and his son-in-law Jared Kushner, ended last night. Let's speak now to Christiane Amanpour, the chief international anchor at CNN. Christiane, hello.
Hello, Hugo. Here we go again.
Here we go again. Thanks very much indeed for being with us. Look, yesterday didn't seem great. Things didn't begin on great ground. Vladimir Putin kept telling reporters beforehand that if Europe wanted to fight, then Russia was ready. And then he kept Witkoff and Kushner waiting for several hours. What do you think this meeting means to the Russians? Are they going through the motions? Do they see it as an opportunity to humiliate America, to humiliate the West? Or do they really think they can get something out of it?
Look, I think, first of all, you heard Marco Rubio, the U.S. Secretary of State, framing it as, it was productive, but no deal yet and a lot more work to be done. So this is the same refrain that we've been hearing for the last several years of this war. Anytime anybody gets anywhere close to Putin or sits around with him from any kind of negotiating standpoint, the demands from the Kremlin remain exactly the same. Everybody has to understand that the objective is to get Putin to the negotiating table because the Ukrainians have already agreed to want to negotiate and to have a ceasefire. The first thing that has to happen is a ceasefire before there can be any meaningful shuttle diplomacy around the next phase, which would be trying to get a peace deal. So they're not even close to that, or maybe they're trying to do that first without even a ceasefire, but it's not working. So there needs to be real planning in how you end these kinds of war. And I think Putin was flexing his muscle. I mean, keeping two senior Americans, one of them the son-in-law of President Trump, the other one Trump's close friend and somebody who's met 6 times with Putin in Moscow this year alone. That's just, classic schoolyard, putting himself up there and trying to say, see, I can make you all wait. But the demands from Russia remain the maximalist demands, which is to neuter, by all intents and purposes, Ukraine and its sovereignty.
So, look, we've had an update from the Kremlin in the last few minutes, now denying reports that it rejected US proposals for peace. The spokesman said parts of the plan were acceptable. I mean, does that seem true? Or are they really negotiating about trying to end the war? Or is the purpose of these negotiations from the Kremlin's point of view just trying to sort of keep sweet enough with the United States and not make an outright enemy of the United States?
Oh, I think that for sure, that last piece for sure. But here's the thing. And of course, Europe doesn't want to go to war with Russia. I mean, it's just a nonsense. These are all talking points. These are straw men that the Kremlin constantly raises. But what Putin and his people want to do is win the war, and they think they can. But if you just look at the facts on the ground, they have not. It's been 4 years and of a massive full-scale invasion. If we go back to the beginning, remember everybody was worried that, oh my gosh, Ukraine, Kyiv could fall within a few days. Do you remember that?
Of course.
Back on February 22nd, 2022. And of course, it confounded everybody by a massive willingness to fight. And then the West poured in weapons for it to defend itself and to fight off this illegal invasion. And the thing is that whatever Putin thinks he can achieve on the ground so far, it hasn't happened. So he's demanding territory that they haven't even won. It's unheard of. It's unprecedented. So clearly, Ukraine is saying, hang on, we're not going to let our brave soldiers, our civilian population who are braving all these illegal missile and drone strikes on civilian targets and infrastructure, we're not going to let that happen in vain. We're not going to give up our land. Our constitution doesn't let it. We've been fighting not just for 4 years, but since 2014, remember. So I think Putin really believes that he can wait out the West, that, as you've seen from the United States, there really is almost no stick. It's all carrot. It's very difficult to understand how the US and Europe is going to get Putin to understand that he needs to come to the negotiating table. I don't think anybody believes at this point that a ceasefire or a peace deal starts with Ukraine getting all its last bit of territory back. I don't think that's the case. I think a ceasefire has to happen right now if they want to start with peace negotiations and likely to be, a ceasefire along the current line of contact, so to speak, and then you negotiate. That's the point. But that's not where Putin is. And whatever's happening, he's not getting the message, either financially or militarily, from Europe or the United States, that he needs to come to the table. He thinks he can still wait them out.
Look, from an American perspective, I mean, the American negotiators, Witkoff and Kushner particularly, they're unconventional negotiators. They're not from a diplomacy background. Kushner, I suppose, had some successes in the Middle East, but still, they're not very much from the normal, the normal background of international diplomacy. Do you think Trump understands what diplomacy is, or does he just think diplomacy is a series of meetings, and eventually, if you have enough meetings, something happens? Are people really doing the kind of what you'd expect to be the groundwork that's done in the background, in the back rooms, with smaller figures where they agree something before it gets to the big names? Or is that just not what the Trump administration understands this process as being about?
The answer is no, that is not what's happening, and that's not what the Trump administration believes. They do believe that because they are deal makers in their private life, that they can transpose that muscle to international, war and peace, conflict resolution, and diplomacy. But it clearly has not worked. And in fact, Trump himself has said that, I thought Ukraine was going to be, or Russia was going to be the easier nut to crack. Remember, he said he would, solve it in 24 hours. That was his first claim. And then as the time has worn on, he said, well, I didn't think that it would be so difficult and that, Putin would be so recalcitrant. But clearly Putin has told him that he thinks he can win. And what happens is that, Trump vacillates between being somewhat tough sometimes, like raising the specter of sanctions, putting sanctions on those oil companies, but then not following through and then sending whatever envoy to meet Putin, wherever they are, or Putin's people. And that thing about listening to the last person in the room. And this is dangerous because these are not American or European talking points. So look at the last time it happened, this so-called 28-point peace plan. It was entirely Kushner, Witkoff, and Lukashev or Kirill Dmitriev, one of those Russians, were sitting in Miami with the Americans, and they came up with what was described as a Russian talking point document that was essentially a surrender document for Ukraine. Clearly, Ukraine rejected it by saying still that it wants to have a peace negotiation, but it won't surrender. Clearly, the Europeans were freaked out. They all got together. They were at the G20 in South Africa. They all got together to figure out how to say, thank you, Mr. Trump. It's great that you're having this peace effort, but here's how we need to amend this document so that it is an actual just peace and it's somewhat realistic. And then Marco Rubio flew over to Geneva to meet with, the sides and try to bring that back from the brink of disaster. Since then, Putin has said, hey, if it's not our talking points, well, we're clearly not interested. And obviously Russia is going to say we're not rejecting it, because that would be dumb to say that to Trump. But until they accept it, then they've rejected it and they continue their own, so the bottom line here is that Ukraine has done what the West wants it to do and its NATO partners want it to do and Trump wants to do. When it was said that we have to have an immediate ceasefire, this was a whole year ago, just about, Ukraine said yes. And Russia said no.
Yeah.
And so it thinks it can still win. And it's a horrible grinding war. And obviously Ukraine is paying a heavy price. Russia is paying a heavy price. Civilians in Ukraine are paying a very heavy price, less so in Russia, but in Ukraine a very heavy price with the constant missiles and drones on populated areas and, towns. So it's a tragedy, but it needs really smart, sensible, hard-nosed, professional diplomacy.
Christiane, we need to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed. That is Christiane Amanpour, Chief International Anchor at CNN.